Hello, everybody. My name is Chris Jonas. I'm the Director of Communications with the National Association for Business Economics. We're pleased to present today's event. Before we start, I did want to mention a few other upcoming NABE events, including the NABE Economic Policy Conference, which will be taking place March 22nd through 23rd. The event will be held virtually with a full 2 days of programming and virtual networking opportunities. We also have a few other upcoming events, including the Outlook survey release this Monday, March 1st at 2 p.m. Eastern. And then we'll have a joint NABE and National Economists Club webinar on the post-pandemic prospects for the Japanese economy on March 4th at 6 p.m. Okay, on to today's event. Note that we will have Q&A open throughout today's discussion. You can submit a question to the panelists at any time using the Q&A box. There will be slide presentations accompanying today's event, and we'll post links to the slides in the chat box. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's event, Charles Steindl, the editor of Business Economics, NABE's quarterly journal, and a resident scholar at Ramapo College of New Jersey. Charlie, I'm going to go hand it over to you. Please stand by.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Thank you, Chris. I think everybody who seriously follows the economy relies most heavily on the labor market data, down to checking on the countdown to the release of the BLS monthly numbers. I should tell you it's only 210 hours and 27 minutes until the release of the February report, in case people aren't watching. With the pandemic, there have been unprecedented moves in the numbers, unprecedented interest in the quality of the reports and the meaning of the statistics. For instance, this week there is an article in the New York Times where people rather confidently assert that the true unemployment rate is 10% or so. And finally, there are unprecedented demands for quick answers to questions about labor market details. So to go into some of these details, we are pleased to have two highly regarded experts today. Erica Groschen is former commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Prior to that, she was at the New York Fed, where she and I were colleagues for a number of years. She is currently a senior economics advisor at Cornell's School of Industrial and Labor Relations, and among numerous other honors, is a distinguished fellow. Labor Relations. Erica will focus on the issues that have confronted the production of the BLS numbers and how the agency has faced them. Our other speaker is Francine Blau, who was Francis Perkins Professor at Cornell's Industrial and Labor Relations School, and among other honors is a distinguished fellow of the American Economic Association. Francine will discuss something that has been casually thrown around since the start of the pandemic. When we talk about essential workers, who precisely are in that group, other than, of course, an economist? Francine also has her collaborators with on the project on a research with her, Pamela Meyerhofer and Josephine Hobey. Erica and Francine will talk for 15 minutes or so, then they will address the questions you have. I now turn it over to Erica.
Thank you, Charlie. Let me share my screen. Okay, so I'm pleased to be here today and to be talking to all the NABE folks, and also to be sharing this this panel with Charlie, my old buddy from the New York Fed, and Francine, who is a great colleague. All right, so what I want to do today is just update you on the labor market post-COVID. And I'm going to focus on the official statistics for that. There are many, of course, private sector statistics that are adding color to the official statistics, but there's so much to talk about with the official statistics, so I'm going to stick with those. All right, so there we go. All right, so I'm going to start talking about the dramatic headline numbers, payroll, jobs, unemployment rate. Then I'm going to go beyond the headlines, and then I'm going to talk a bit about looking forward, what I see in those numbers that might help us think about prospects going forward. So let's start with those dramatic numbers. You may have seen a chart that looks something like this before. This compares payroll jobs, the path of payroll jobs since employment peaks all the way through all the post-war recessions. The orange line shows the pattern of the Great Recession, and you can see that it had longer duration and was deeper than any of the other post-war recessions. And when you compare that to the current recession, you see that the COVID recession, first of all, had a really abrupt and extremely steep decline. The recovery from it initially was very rapid, and it got us about half the way back. And since then, it has flattened. So that's from a payroll point of view, I think pretty stark that we have something that's more than double the size of the Great Recession, that we're about halfway back, getting back to the deepest part of the Great Recession, but we are already flat. We've seen no recent improvement. So let's turn now to taking just a quick look at the industry impact. So this is still payroll jobs, and I'm looking at what were the job losses. Those are the bars shown in red from February to April 2020. The blue bars show you the recovery from April to January. What you can see is that there's a very high correlation, negative correlation between the two. In fact, it's on the order of 0.94. So what we are getting, what we've gotten so far is almost entirely just essentially recalls to people of the jobs that were lost. Now, let's turn to the household survey where we get the employment rate. That's the headline from the unemployment rate is the headline from the payroll survey or the household survey. And this shows the path from January to January 2020 to 21 of the unemployment rate. That's the blue line. And above it, dotted lines, is the unemployment rate plus the maximum impact of misclassifications. So this is something that the BLS has been reporting on a monthly basis since March, and it reflects people who are very likely really on temporary layoff, but the way they've answered the questions has classified them as if they were on leave, but not at work. So they had a job, but they're not at work. And you can see for workers and companies that are not used to temporary layoffs that they might be confused about the way they would be, the way that they would answer questions, and the people who ask the questions may not be steering them quite as well as they could be. So you can see that the biggest difference was in April, where the official unemployment rate was 14.7, but the BLS estimated that as many as almost 5% of the workers could have been, of the labor force could have been misclassified that month. Since then it's gone down, but it has not gone away. And in fact, the past couple of months, it's been higher than it was in September and October. But April 2020 was still the largest 1 month jump in the series. And it's similar to the payroll survey in the sense that it's certainly flattened in the past month, particularly if you look at the adjusted rate. There's been very little improvement since October. All right. These unemployment rates vary by race. This compares the overall line, which is in red here, which is now 6.3%. To the ones for Black African Americans at 9.2%, Hispanics. Hispanics have had an interesting pattern in that the unemployment rate for Hispanic workers jumped far higher than the African American one in April, and has since come down to being lower than the African American one, although the last couple of months shows a narrowing again. Asians also typically have had a lower unemployment rate than white workers, but the recession has changed that in some ways. And in fact, the last month, the Asian unemployment rate is higher than the white unemployment rate. All right. So now I'm going to turn to job disruptions. And by job disruptions, I mean that very often when you're looking at a particular situation, it's quite useful, of course, to look at the headline numbers to put it into historical context. But headline numbers cannot track everything. One number can't express the depth of the most complicated and largest market in the country. And so to fully understand what's going on, you need to go beyond that. And there are many ways that workers' jobs can be disrupted. They can be laid off, but there can also be unofficial layoffs, as we said, like with a job, people who are with a job but not at work because their employers perhaps said, oh, take extra sick days or call it a leave of some sort, right? Workers can also be on short hours. And very importantly, they may have left the labor force entirely, in which case they're not in the numerator or the denominator. And this also helps you look at whether or not employees have a connection with their employers. So this is a calculation that I have done and where I look at all of those possible sources of disruption. What I want to do is underline two things. First of all, the headline unemployment rate certainly understates the disruptions because we have all these other ways that workers can be affected. And the other thing I want to show you is that ties to employers are falling throughout time. So the darkest line here at the bottom is similar to the BLS measure of misclassified workers. It's actually a bit more inclusive. The next line up are the workers who are working part-time involuntarily, workers part-time for economic reasons. And you can see there was a big increase and it is still quite high. The part of disruptions that has declined most have been the number of workers on temporary layoffs, this light blue area here. That has gone down dramatically. Meanwhile, the gold area, which is the workers who are permanent, who are unemployed without a connection to their employer, this gold part, that has essentially been growing over time. And then these two parts, the two purple parts, are the workers who are out of the labor force who say they do or don't want a job. And you can see that those have not really diminished all that much since April. So we're looking at a very different distribution of disruptions from April to where we are in January. And the sum of these three blue lines are the workers who are disrupted but maintain a connection to their employers. And that was most of the disruptions in April and now is less than half. Okay. The Federal Reserve has been talking about an alternative measure lately. Theirs is equivalent in many ways to what I'm showing you here, but it doesn't have short hours and the people who are with a job and not at work. So who are not in the misclassified area. So if looking at theirs tells a somewhat similar story. Now, the other difference is that my measure is measuring all the people who've been added to this state since the pandemic, and they've been using something that's closer to the unemployment rate. So the Fed measure, it should be compared to historical unemployment rates, although it doesn't account for exits that might have happened from the labor force during previous recessions. All right, so why do I keep talking about employee-employee job connections and the recovery? Well, if your job has been disrupted, but you maintain a connection to your employer, then your employer will have less time to refill that position when they want to refill it, because they can just recall you. You have been trained, you've been onboarded, you're immediately productive. And you, certainly the worker and the employer, will have less anxiety and uncertainty for as long as you have this connection. Right? So there's no doubt that the quick recovery was speeded by the fact that so many of these workers were expecting to go back to work and did. But the remaining jobs with connections, first of all, are a smaller number. And they can't guarantee a similar rapid recovery because these employers may fail or they may be changing operations. The ties can weaken with the employers. And of course, the workers themselves may have died, become disabled, or have left the labor force. So they're no longer quite as much of a pull, a source of rapid recalls as they used to be. So we're going to need investments, new businesses, and retraining once the pandemic allows. What does this mean looking forward? Well, I want to distinguish between the direct effects of the pandemic and the typical recessionary spiral. In the typical recession, we get a shock that leads to job and revenue losses, and you get an increase in uncertainty, which causes precautionary restraint, which causes more uncertainty, which causes more restraint, and that's how you get the downward spiral. But what breaks it are policy moves in particular, and investment, both public and private. So the question is, having had this big shock, are we going to get the typical recessionary spiral? And the arguments that yes, it'll happen is that it usually does after shocks like this. But the arguments against it have been healthy balance sheets in many parts of the economy, and the analogy drawn to natural disasters. And then finally, the strength of the policy response. So I think that's up in the air, but I think it's too easily discounted by the optimists in the market. Okay, so what are the four sources of job growth during the recovery? Well, two sources of them are old jobs regained, both from the jobs lost from pandemic restrictions and also those lost from this recessionary spiral that we talked about. But there are also new jobs that are created, that will be created once they can be. And the new jobs that will be associated with continuation of trends we already knew in place: automation, globalization, climate change, demographics, et cetera. And also some long-run impacts of the pandemic that we've talked about: changes in jobs because of more remote work and transactions, supply chain management being affected, communal living, safety, infrastructure needs that have been revealed. So there will be a different set of jobs created, as well as some that return. So the story I've been telling you has been described as the swoosh, that for 2021, we can expect perhaps the shutdown effects to moderate, but we may have this recession taking hold, and all of this suggests that we might have a high churn. And then I think it's most likely to think that to get back to trend, not just to where we were before, but to get back to trend, it's going to take us a while. The fastest part of the recovery is almost certainly over. We're talking about some sort of a long slog, and this is where policy can really make a difference. So let me end with a plug for the need for official statistics. COVID has made many challenges starkly apparent, and I think that's certainly true on the statistical side. There's been much cry for better statistics to help inform decisions and target policy, and this takes the form of people wanting more granularity, more timeliness, frequency, consistency across products, agility to ask new questions, guaranteed independence from political influence, and then of course privacy protection is important. So let me encourage you to do what you can to help improve the statistics so that we get there. First of all, of course, you need to decry political interference wherever you see it. The statistical system cannot function without trust. And then don't be a free rider. Speak up for the need for evidence and for official statistics in particular. Attest to their trustworthiness, debunk attacks on statistics and statistical system. Cite your sources always so that people know that where this information comes from. Participate in federal surveys and ensure that your employers and your friends and family participate in those surveys. That's what keeps the quality good. Support funding and any needed restructuring of the statistical system. And then finally, I'll put in a special plug for joining the Friends of BLS. And here are 3 ways you can do it. You can go to the website, you can do it on LinkedIn, and you can follow on Twitter. Oh, I left this in. Okay, this is deficit spending. We can talk about this more lately, more afterwards. This is why deficit spending, I think, is not a problem right now. Oh, hang on a minute. This is what I actually went the wrong way. This is what I wanted to show you. So this is my summary slide. Our economic recovery has been abrupt. We had a deep shock by historical standards. We're about halfway back. The headline statistics are understating the impact on workers. That doesn't mean that BLS is doing a bad job. It means that you, as a smart consumer of statistics, have to always be ensuring that the headline numbers are telling the full story. The jobs recovery has slowed markedly. It's, I think, because we no longer have as many workers tied to their employers, that we have now dimmer prospects for a further rapid recovery. Hispanic, African American, and women's jobs have been more disrupted than others, and the prospects depend on the pandemic, the recessionary dynamic, fiscal relief and stimulus, and of course, official statistics to guide decisions at all levels. So thank you. And
Thank you. Before we move to Francine, I have one quick question, which maybe you can answer. Question is, which of these unemployment are the unemployment rates which include the misclassifications published?
Yes. They are not, I mean, if you go to the BLS website, you won't actually find the series listed for you, but every month BLS tells you what those numbers are, which is where I got them.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Now, Chris, we'll turn over to Francine.
Okay. I have to stop my sharing. Oh, okay. You did it for me. Thank you.
Okay. Francine, you.
Yes, sorry. Hi, everybody. First of all, let me just say I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to this group. It's really great to see my colleague Erica, since we're a bit homebound right now. And so let me go ahead and share my screen and tell you a little bit more about what I will be doing. So this is work, and I thought Charlie introduced it very well on this concept that gets bandied about a lot, but often lacks precision. And that is, who are the essential and frontline workers? I'd like to point out very gratefully, this is joint work with Josephine Kobe and Pamela Meyerhopper, as Charlie noted, and I'm glad to say, are both here. So sorry, I'm a little, there we go. So the goal, I'm going to give you a report on a research project, and the goal was to identify the demographic and labor market characteristics of essential and frontline workers. Now, I'm going to be talking about this in more precision, but basically essential workers are workers needed to supply us with essential infrastructure, services, and to keep our economy safe and running. Frontline workers are a subset of essential workers who need, by the nature of their jobs, to perform those jobs in person. So some examples are, of course, healthcare workers, and there have been a lot of well-merited attention to them. But as we've gone further into the pandemic, we've realized that all kinds of workers are involved in frontline work. Truck drivers, grocery store clerks, janitorial services, and many others. Those are just a few examples. Now, why is this important? Well, if we want to formulate social insurance and safety net policies that adequately meet the group of workers, and especially the frontline workers who are taking the largest risks, we need to know more about who they are. In addition, we need to have some estimates of these parameters to know how to allocate scarce resources like personal protective equipment, and recently, of course, very importantly in the news, vaccines. And I would point out there's often a confusion between essential and frontline workers, and these terms are often used interchangeably, and they are not. And I think when the government first came out with guidelines on who should be vaccinated, they mentioned essential workers, which is, as we'll see, a very large group, not all of whom, only a portion of whom face the risk of contact with others. And then they did narrow that down to frontline workers. So this actually was not easy. When we got interested in doing this, we faced a number of problems and decisions we needed to make. First of all, of course, the definitions of essential and frontline vary from place to place, and that's state to state, but sometimes even locality to locality. Second is the point I've made already, that not all essential workers face similar risks, and it is important to distinguish between the larger group of essential workers and the subgroup of frontline workers. But how can one do that systematically? Especially another issue especially early in the COVID crisis, some industries were virtually completely shut down or operating under greatly reduced demand. So in the early portion of the pandemic, to identify who was actually working in essential or frontline jobs, you'd have to take these shutdowns into account. So these are the difficulties we faced. And what we did was we used official Department of Homeland Security guidelines that were issued early in the pandemic, March 2020, to identify essential industries. That's industries providing critical infrastructure. And then we applied this definition to microdata, Erica, provided by the Census Bureau, an important government data set, called the American Community Survey, from the two most recent years prior to the pandemic, to identify the workers in these industries in normal times. Then, to estimate which portion of them were frontline workers, we used data on the feasibility of working from home in the workers' occupation group. So very helpful research by two other scholars helped us to identify, in terms of answers to questionnaires, whether it was possible to do the work remotely, that is from home, or whether they would have to provide it in person. And what we did was classify occupation groups where a third or less of the workers were able to work from home. We classified those as frontline. Then early in the pandemic, we did find a source that identified for us industries that were shut down or running under extremely limited demand. And we were able to, in some of our estimates, exclude those industries and see what the consequences would be. Now, I feel I'm in kind of a time warp, where time seems to sometimes be passing very slowly and other times passing extremely rapidly. But what seems now, March almost seems like a lifetime ago. And the government has changed its guidelines over time as in terms of essential industries. So we perform a similar analysis using the definitions for December 2020. We spend a little less time on them, but we use them for basis of comparison to tell you what the situation is right now. And for this exercise, we do not exclude shutdown industries because currently shutdowns are far fewer and they are much more heterogeneous across states. So let's start with March 2020. What did we find? Basically, we found that essential workers are a large portion, defined as they are defined by the Department of Homeland Security in affected industries, are a large portion of the workforce, 70% of the workforce. And so not surprisingly, their characteristics that we're interested in, their demographic and labor market characteristics, are broadly similar to the labor force as a whole. I would note they are slightly more male, somewhat less well-educated, and they have somewhat higher shares of Hispanics and immigrants, but overall, again, they're quite similar to the workforce as a whole. Frontline workers, on the other hand, are a much smaller group, 43% of the workforce, and they do differ from the overall labor force quite significantly. First of all, although there was some confusion about this in early newspaper articles, they are a more heavily male group overall. So the labor force as a whole is 47% female. Again, essential workers, somewhat less, but frontline workers are, or were in March, 39% female. So they were majority disproportionately male. They were a less well-educated group. And the way to look at this chart is we have divided education into 4 categories. And let's start with the labor force as a whole. Those with less than a high school degree in black, those with exactly a high school degree in dark green, some college in light green, and then a bachelor's or more in even lighter green. So what you can see is that the chart for the essential workers doesn't look that different, but for the frontline workers, there are clearly more individuals with less than a high school degree and considerably fewer individuals with a BA degree or more. And these are the exact numbers. 14% have less than a high school degree compared to 9% for the labor force as a whole. And 19% are highly educated compared to 35% for the labor force as a whole. Frontline workers have a higher share of disadvantaged minorities, Blacks, and very especially Hispanics. When we compare the labor force as a whole up here and the frontline workers here, you see the share that are white. This very dark blue bar is lower for frontline workers. The share who are Black is a bit higher, 13% Black, compared to 12% Black overall, but most notably is Hispanics in this these gray bars, who are 22% of frontline workers compared to 18% of workers overall. Frontline workers also have a higher share of immigrants than the labor force as a whole, 19% for the labor force as a whole compared to 22% for frontline workers in March. And they have, not surprising now that we've gone through their characteristics, they have lower wages. So the average wages for all workers, $27.50. Very similar for essential workers, but the subgroup of frontline workers have lower average wages, and they also have a larger share compared to the full workforce, a larger share in low wage jobs and a smaller share earning high wages compared to the workforce as a whole. So I think you're getting the basic picture of them as a group that is challenged to some extent compared to the labor force as a whole in terms of their characteristics. Now let's take a quick look at their occupations. Which broad occupation groups are frontline workers in? Well, the group that we first consider, there's a reason we first consider healthcare, because actually healthcare workers are a substantial portion of frontline workers, but they fall into two major categories. And one, healthcare practitioners and technicians, which includes nurses, doctors, and other professionals, are a relatively highly educated group, 60% with a BA degree or more, and quite a high wage group. They are also a disproportionately female group. Remember, we said frontline workers overall were disproportionately male, but 75% of the healthcare practitioners and techs are female. The other group is kind of the polar opposite, those who work in healthcare support. They are even more female, 86%, but they are a relatively less well-educated group, somewhat more with less than high school, but particularly noticeably less than the labor force as a whole, who have college degrees, and their wages are quite low. Another set of jobs are jobs that earn about the same as the labor force. That's the small, relatively small group of protective service workers who are disproportionately male, and also sales workers. They're a larger group, and also one in which women are represented, in this case, about at the same level as the workforce as a whole. Both those groups earn about average wages, and the rest of the categories are low wage workers. First of all, we do have food preparation and serving, in which women are substantially represented, and I'm going to come back to that job in a minute. You may have been thinking, but how many restaurants were open in March? And that's exactly correct. But the other groups are a number of, for the most part, a number of relatively below average paying, predominantly male, blue collar jobs. And this is why the group overall is predominantly male. We have buildings and grounds, maintenance and repair. We have farming jobs, construction, installation, maintenance and repair, production jobs. Remember, many production jobs did continue even in the early period, and those jobs did involve contact with others, including co-workers, and a large group involved in transportation and material moving. So let me just briefly recap here. Frontline workers, as I've mentioned, are on average a lower wage group. They're less educated than the workforce as a whole. They have a higher representation than the overall workforce of disadvantaged minorities, especially Hispanics and immigrants. While they include high-paying healthcare practitioners and technicians, and some jobs that pay average wages, most of the occupations are relatively low-paying jobs, including, again, healthcare support, food preparation, serving, and a number of predominantly male blue-collar categories. What about shutdowns? Well, shutdowns were quite important. The share of the workforce in frontline jobs was greatly diminished when we took shutdowns into account, from 43% of the labor force to 34%. Percent female was slightly decreased. The occupation that took the biggest hit, again, as you might be suspecting, was food preparation and serving occupations, where a number of these were almost entire in restaurant dining, for example, was almost entirely shut down. We left with skeleton crews and people who were providing food for takeout. But interestingly, even when we made all those adjustments, we found that our basic conclusions in terms of wages, education, representation of men and disadvantaged minorities and immigrants, those conclusions were unchanged, even for the group affected by shutdowns. So updating to December, this is close to today. The major change, there are a few other minor ones, but the major change was the inclusion by the Department of Homeland Security guidelines of the education sector in essential and frontline jobs. And this is quite a large group. It would constitute 14% of frontline workers and indeed 6% of workers overall. And it does differ from a number of the other frontline occupational categories. It's more female, it's better educated, BA plus is quite well represented, with wages that are about average, about the same as the workforce as a whole. Now, a very large component of the education sector are employees in elementary and secondary schools. They comprise 73% of essential frontline education jobs. Now, we acknowledge that not all of them are working in person right now, but clearly that is the goal. So how do things change when we add these additional workers? Essential workers are now up to 82% of the workforce. It's actually a very high proportion of the workforce. And as before, of course, their demographic and labor market characteristics do mirror the labor force as a whole. Frontline workers now are boosted to a little over half the workforce, up from 43%. And our conclusions, nonetheless, with the addition of the education sector and the rise in the share of frontline workers, our overall conclusions remain the same in terms of their lower wages, less education on average, and higher representation of minorities and immigrants. But given the characteristics of the education sector, which I pointed out to you, there are some small differences. The share of women in frontline workers has gone up from 39% in March to 43% now, again, with the especially the addition of elementary and secondary school workers. And education levels have gone up. So while the group of frontline workers remains less well educated than the labor force as a whole, the disparity has been diminished. So the share with less than high school has gone down, and the share with a BA degree or more has gone up. But I don't want to pound it too heavily at your head. The overall characteristics of this group are still the same. So my conclusion is that frontline workers must take on considerable risk to do their jobs. And I think all of the occupational categories in the frontline group are encountering more risk than they would have expected, even healthcare workers, when they entered their profession. But at the same time, overall, they're a group, on average at least, that is, from an economic perspective, least well able to deal with these risks, economically at least. So their characteristics are important when we consider policy. Now, we've already pretty deeply into the pandemic, and there are some things I wish we had considered more deeply earlier on, but I do want to mention them. They are still relevant. Hazard pay. This was an idea that was bandied about, and especially for some of these very low wage categories, but it really didn't seem to stick very much. Paid sick leave. Many of these workers don't have paid sick leave and can't afford to take time off if they get sick. Well, this is disastrous when you think of the problem of spreading of the virus, because if they feel they have to come to work, they may give it to coworkers and customers. Even health insurance. Our health insurance coverage, as we all know, is quite spotty, and if they do get sick, they may not have it. And and I do want to point out that while, again, this group is disproportionately male, women are very substantially represented, particularly in the key sectors of healthcare and education. And this has put a spotlight on the terrible childcare problems they face, potentially both parents face, but we know disproportionately impact women. The problem they faced with shutdowns of the education system and childcare availability. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about this. Oops. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Is Chris? Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
I was trying to figure out how to close my slides.
Thank you. In some ways, Francine, that's a very sobering presentation. This is overwhelming fraction of the workforce can be fairly classified as frontline or essential. They skew low on wages and education, which given the income distribution in the United States is not all that surprising. And yet, when there are proposals that we should reform things to make them more protected and healthier, we get complaints, it's too expensive, or you're going to destroy incentives. It's kind of disturbing. I do have a question which actually kind of relates to that, and maybe Erica could chime in too, from somebody who says, we look at the jobs of the future and these are the sorts of people who will be taking them. It seems like certain skills like coding are essential. And the question is, we don't seem to have programs in place for people to learn those. And I don't know if anybody has any comments on that, whether Erica or Francine would have any comments on that specifically or in general.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think it's closely related to the point Erica made. Going on from here, we are going to have to seriously consider retraining, and what kind of retraining would most help people. And in terms of you're saying was sobering, I think the other thing, Charlie, is that we were hurting ourselves by not providing some of these services because the virus was really spreading more because of it. So Erica, what would you like to say?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with Fran here that in general, we have neglected our workforce development system. And this is another case of that now. There are a couple of things that could be done to really help it. One is, of course, improving the data that they can work from, and there are some important ways that that could be improved, and I'll be happy to talk about some of them. But one of the main ways would be to change access to already existing administrative data so that that could be used to provide much more guidance on what jobs are growing and disappearing, et cetera. The other thing that we want to do is understand our training systems better. So the last time the Bureau of Labor Statistics was funded to conduct the survey of employer provided training was, ready for this, 1995. So we might really want to know what's going on with this huge part of our national training system that we have no way of measuring at the moment. Employer training has always been a very large part of the way that training happens in the US, but we don't know if that's gotten larger or smaller, and we don't know as much as we should about best practices, and companies are flying blind in their training decisions because of this. So I'd say that that's very important. And generally speaking, we have justified the importance of technological change and open trade on the basis of saying that that increases the size of the pie for everybody, but we have not made sure that this admittedly smaller group, but not inconsequential group of people who suffer as a result of these changes are held harmless for these changes by held harmless, that's this legal term, but the idea is that we haven't diverted some of the benefits of technological change and trade to ensure that people are not hurt by these developments. Indeed, because when they are hurt by them, first of all, they're hurt, which is a problem, but the other problem is that then they correctly, accurately fear those developments and will work to block them because they know they're at risk. And that's problematic as well. So I completely agree.
Could I just jump in and pick up? I think your last point is just incredibly important. And I think we paid some high social prices for not doing that. Another interesting wrinkle to this, Charlie, is that as important as globalization and technical change are, and it's been found actually by a number of economists that the very low end is less negatively impacted because these are individuals who do need to provide their services in person. So that's kind of a positive development. But I think what's happened, honestly, socially, as a little attention at least was paid to these frontline workers is, whoa, these people are doing a lot for us. Is that really what we're paying them? Do they really not have those benefits, et cetera? So I think another arm of this is to look carefully at those jobs, the needs of those workers, and to upgrade them.
And then I would add, keep going in that direction, is that by and large, these workers have very little avenue for voice within their jobs anymore. As we've had decline in unionism and other mechanisms for them to express themselves, including the increase of contracting out as a main way that these jobs are organized, then workers have much less voice in trying to affect the terms and conditions under which they work than they used to in an earlier day. And that's clearly problematic. We've all heard stories about that.
All right. Do we have any more questions from the audience?
Charlie, if you don't mind me jumping on really quick, there were several questions that I answered as they came up about our coding and how we translated those guidelines. If anybody is interested, I put my email in the Q&A. It's just my name, pamela.meyerhofer@montana.edu. And we have over time curated a beautiful email with matching coding that I can easily send that explains how we code up each, and it includes both our March and our December definitions, and we'll be updating our working paper with the December definitions too. So if you are doing research in this area and you would like that information, please feel free to reach out.
Okay. Actually, I think I have one quick question, Francine. In your work, does that include the public sector as well as the private? I guess it does, since you have education.
Yeah, it is whatever was defined as essential. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. All right, Chris, I think we're about done.
Okay, thank you. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining today. Just as a reminder, All past webinars are available in the NABE Connect app, which can be downloaded in the App Store and through Google Play. We also have our webinar recordings available for NABE members on the NABE.com digital archive. Okay, thank you all again. This does conclude the event. This is copyright 2021 by the National Association for Business Economics with all rights reserved. Thank you all again. We'll see you next time. Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you.